Great. Yeah, so I want to cover a little bit of this work that we've been doing on sort of generically what we jokingly refer to as studying jerks on the web. So a number of socio-technical problems on the web. So this is really goes hand in hand with Rephrain's work on online harms and cyber safety. And I'm going to try to sort of give some case studies, right? So and through the case studies, I'll try to cover some of the tools that we use, with this generic term that we use, like data science, some data science tools that we use to do a number of sort of quantitative, large-scale analysis of these online harms issues on social media. Okay, so like I said, these are case studies that I selected mostly to sort of show some of the tools that we use, and I'm really happy to sort of go fast or slow on the tools and give more details about them depending on sort of the audience interest. So like I said, please feel free to stop in anytime. Okay, so before I start, let me sort of provide a warning that there is going to be content in this talk that might be offensive. It's uncensored, and the reason is that we take this sort of empirical approach to studying the problem. So we're going to report the data as we see it and how we see it, without sort of any filtering. So I apologize in advance, as some of the things you'll see in some of the slides are not so pleasant, to say the least. But a case in point here that is going to hopefully become clear during my time here is that actually drawing the line as to what you might want to consider toxic or offensive is highly subjective and very context dependent. So it would actually require, it's a non-trivial thing to define some kind of policy, some kind of mechanism to decide what to show and what not to show, right? And that's actually something I wanted to draw the attention on as we go through the talk. All right, so okay. Sorry, I have some issues with this. Okay, so overall, the work that we've been doing, and not just us, right, looks at ways where the web might be weaponized by sort of a number of actors, right? And you have a number of issues on that we refer to as online harms in the UK that range from cyberbullying, cyber aggression, to sort of targeted hate like misogyny or disinformation, all the way to state level actions like election interference, right? And there are a number of initiatives that look at these issues, and Rephrain is one of them. And obviously there is a number of amazing researchers worldwide that try to do something about it, right? So, and when I started working on this, so my main background is information security, right? I used to be a cryptographer. I'm a recovering cryptographer, and I do a lot of work on privacy as well. So I started looking at this problem a little bit from the point of view of sort of the information security perspective, the information security mindset, and and in fact, there is a lot of work, a lot of great work that throughout the years has looked at ways to mitigate sort of unwanted activities on social network. But this doesn't really apply to all of the problems, right? So a lot of the issues that I described, that I talked about with respect to online harms, deal with human activity, right? So, and human activity is much less coordinated than unwanted activity like bot activity. you have characteristic traits that stand out much less. So, it's different from problems from the information security point of view, like fraud or spam, and then a number of other things. So while we have a lot of experience detecting synchronized activity, we don't necessarily have a lot of sort of automated ways to combat, to understand human activity that is loosely synchronized. And it's hard sometimes to distinguish from, let's say, regular activity, like non-malicious activities, as there is a number of common talking points and so on. And stuff like this. All right, so another important differentiations from sort of the standard security, traditional maybe security approach to fighting unwanted activities on social network is that you can often take the fight on whether or not you can take the fight on economic grounds, right? So take the example of spam, for instance, on social networks. What you do usually is to try and make it less profitable or more expensive for spammers to operate on your network, and so they go somewhere else, right? But economic grants might not be necessarily meaningful when you talk about deep-pocketed state-level adversaries or malevolent actors that engage in cyberbullying, for instance. They're not motivated by making money necessarily, right? So, and this is something sort of to keep in mind before we dive into this problem, right? The other thing that is important to understand is that online services obviously do not exist in a vacuum, right? And stuff like this. All right, so another important differentiations from sort of the standard security, traditional maybe security approach to fighting unwanted activities on social network is that you can often take the fight on whether or not you can take the fight on economic grounds, right? So take the example of spam, for instance, on social network. What you do usually is to try and make it less profitable or more expensive for spammers to operate on your network, and so they go somewhere else, right? But economic grants might not be necessarily meaningful when you talk about deep-pocketed state-level adversaries or malevolent actors that engage in cyberbullying, for instance. They're not motivated by making money necessarily, right? So, and this is something sort of to keep in mind before we dive into this problem, right? The other thing that is important to understand is that online services obviously do not exist in a vacuum, right? Right, and this is very important with respect to studying some of these problems that I mentioned, because it's very, very important to understand the interplay between different platforms, right? So, and we're not talking about only the same kind of platform like social networks. Social networks obviously are influenced and influence other types of platforms like multimedia or news, right? So all of these ecosystems, they have a very important interplay that needs to be taken into account when looking at socio-technical problems like online harms, right? And in particular, it's important to understand that looking at a single service at a time is not enough for most of these problems, and that there are so-called fringe web communities. So let's say, let's think about certain small sub-communities of Reddit, some subreddits, or social networks that don't have billions of users like Facebook and Twitter, but they're much smaller, like 4chan is a classic example that actually play a crucial role vis-a-vis some of the online harms issues and this concept of weaponizing the web. And I'm going to give you some concrete examples here. So I think these two observations is really what drove me into really into this line of work, and sort of required a little bit of a mind switch from sort of the standard information security mindset to this new set of problems. So, and I'm going to, like I said, start with a number of case studies, and the first one is sort of the concept of cyber aggression, right? So you might have heard a number of incidents online about how certain communities coordinated attacks to bully and force off minorities and activists and some celebrities off social media. You probably have heard how certain conspiracy theories came out of platforms like 4chan. Pizzagate is or QAnon is one of the examples, and how and importantly, you have really some of these. You have a lot of these issues that are not longer confined, let's say, in the web ecosystems, but they also sort of spill over in the real world with a number of real world accidents and like things like mass shootings, where the perpetrators were sort of radicalized on the internet, right? And you have examples of the El Paso shooting, the New Zealand shooting, Pittsburgh Mosque shooting, and Pittsburgh Synagogue shooting, and so on. And one of the common sort of items within some of these examples that I mentioned is a particular platform called 4chan. And this was actually, I'm trying to also share sort of my journey through this line of work, through this research. And so I started sort of working on these problems. And the first place that I sort of hit, that sort of interests me research-wise, was this platform called 4chan. So 4chan is a very important player with respect to internet culture. So they have created a lot of it. They contributed a lot of it, despite being a sort of a small community. So you might have seen things like the lolcats. At some point, 4chan was sort of the platform where the anonymous hacker groups was coordinating, sort of mastered the concept of trolling online. And they produced a number of sort of internet culture memes like Pepe the Frog that really went deep into real world culture, to the point that the then candidate Donald Trump in 2016 retweeted a picture of himself looking like Pepe the Frog. So Pepe the Frog is a meme that was not started by 4chan, but sort of was appropriated by 4chan, the 4chan community, and quickly became a symbol of hate. So is actually designated as a symbol of hate by a number of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and so on. And these communities being particularly active, also politically. So they have played a big role in the 2016 presidential election in the US, and they still do with things like the QAnon conspiracy. So this picture is from the January 6th riots at the US Capitol. And so you can see here a number of people with this flag, which is the Kekistani flag. So it's a really 4chan heavy meme. So Kek is a sort of a 4chan meme that relates to some kind of deity, sort of the god of 4chan. And so they created this imaginary country called Kekistan, and this is their flag. So you can see some of the rioters displaying the flag here. So, but what is 4chan, right? So if you haven't heard of it, it's essentially an image board forum, as a very sort of retro UI. It's organized in boards. I think there's 70 at the moment. And you can create a new thread by making a post has to have an image attached. And this is important because actually it is an image board. So everything, has to have at least one image. Every thread has to have at least one image with the original submission, right? And actually in our study, we find that these images are quite unique. So users actually do not just reuse the same images or download sort of images from other places and post them online. They actually create a lot of original content. So it's a lot of memes, it's sort of, photoshopping things together, pictures with like text on the background. And there is really a lot of information in these images. I'll come back to this later in the talk. So other users can reply can create replies to the original thread with or without images, referencing, quoting text, and so on. So these are the boards that are active at the moment. And in particular, we focus on one called Politically Incorrect, or POL, which is a not safe for work board where really there is pretty much no rules. Like everything goes. There is some regulation about stuff being off topic, but pretty much it's really considered a everything goes kind of board. And there is a couple of important features that make 4chan different from sort of your traditional platforms. One is anonymity. So you don't need to register an account to post. In fact, anonymity is the default and preferred behavior. I mean, you can obviously sign your posts, but this really doesn't happen. There is some degree of permanence. So you can essentially create something called a trip code, which is a hash of a password, essentially. They're not really used that much, but essentially it's a way to link posts. You can link your posts across the platform using these trip codes. And I mentioned this not because it's used much, but because it was used by Q in the QAnon conspiracy theory. I don't have time to cover that, but if you have heard of QAnon, or if you want to know more, know that sort of Q, the starter of the conspiracy theory, use the trip codes to kind of authenticate themselves as the author of the posts that actually came from Q. The other feature is ephemerality. So all threads get archived after a while. So there is actually a limit on how long any thread can survive, can be active, and so you can post on it. After a while, it kind of gets frozen and moved to an archive. And 1 week after that, it actually is actually deleted. Okay, there are a number of websites that sort of keep these archives. One is called For Plebs, but essentially on the platform itself, everything is deleted, and that affects a lot the behavior of the users. So essentially, there is no memory, right? You cannot, when you post a question on some forum, usually people might answer, "Oh, this has already been answered," or they might link to some thread from a year ago. This doesn't happen on 4chan, and this affects a lot the way people behave, because essentially there is no memory. So certain themes keep coming back, right? Because there's a sort of completely new threads, right? And I'll give you some example as to how this directly affects us. So periodically, people find out on 4chan posts about our research, and sort of keeps coming back with, "Oh my God, they're studying us," or a number of sort of interesting posts about us. Obviously, the first step with respect to applying data science and doing sort of quantitative work on online harms is getting data, right? So one of our first projects was really studying 4chan. So we have been collecting data from 4chan since June 2016. And at some point, we actually released a snapshot of the data. So there are conferences like ICWSM that have a data set track. So they actually encourage submissions of papers that come with a data set. And so there is, you make this data available on open source platforms like Zenodo. There are others, and you have a paper that sort of describe what this data is and how to reuse it and what to do about it. And we found that this data set was quite useful for, especially for social science researchers that don't necessarily had the ability to collect the data themselves and sort of parse it and so on. So they can actually download the data set, and there is a very simple JSON format that allows people to maybe search for specific keywords or look at specific characteristics of the data. So this snapshot is currently available. I mean, we're keeping the data collection going, but this data set is available, like I said, on Zenodo. Has about 3.5 years worth of data. There's millions of threads and hundreds of millions of posts. And we actually sort of augment this data set with two features. One is providing toxicity scores. So we use the Google's Perspective API, which takes in input some text and returns a score from 0 to 1 as to how toxic. There are several labels, but to simplify, just consider toxicity. So to say how toxic is a certain text. So you don't have to run the text through the API because it's actually computationally expensive, and you need to have an API key that has a limit on how many queries you can do to the Google Cloud infrastructure. So we give it to you. And also there is an entity extraction process that we put the output of in the data set, which is essentially named entities. So things like a country or a famous person like Donald Trump, right? So these SpaceEye library returns these named entities in some text. So that makes it easier to search for, let's say you want to retrieve all posts that discuss Donald Trump. You can just search Donald Trump on the labels that we attach to the data set. So this named entity. So once you get the data, what do you do with it, right? So there is usually the kind of research that you might want to do, or at least that we do, can somewhat fall into two categories. So one is sort of exploratory work. So you get the data and you start looking at it from different angles. Like you try to analyze it with respect to the characteristics that they have, maybe from a point of view of like evolutionary, like temporal features. Sort of you try to do some kind of longitudinal study of the data, see how certain things change over time. You look at the content, you look at what are the URLs that are in this data set from this particular platform. Where are the hashtags? Where are the images? Or again, like temporal features, how the number of posts grows or declines over time, or how it is associated to certain events like elections or things like that. And the other kind of work, so this is exploratory work. The second kind of work is hypothesis based. Like you have a specific research question or research hypothesis, and you say, okay, I think that, I'll give you a stupid example. I think that during the Brexit referendum campaign, the toxicity, anti-immigration rhetoric on social media went up in particular areas, for instance, right? And so you take the data and you try to, test this hypothesis. Okay, so let me start with the first kind of research question. So the exploratory side. So you take the data and you look at things like, is this data hateful, for instance? What is the level of toxicity that you have on this data? So I already mentioned the Perspective API, but you can do simple sort of keyword matching. So this is the first thing that we did. We took this hate-based dictionary that is essentially a dictionary of hate words in the English language. We manually filtered it a little bit to remove sort of trying to remove ambiguity. And we essentially ran an intersection protocol between the data that we had and the dictionary, and we found out, there is a lot of hateful words, like 2% of posts on 4chan have at least one occurrence of the N word, right? This is extremely high. And overall, we find matches of hate words on 12% of this politically incorrect board posts. And this is like one order of magnitude of Twitter, more than Twitter, and this is done actually before Twitter started to be more aggressive in removing hate speech. But you can see that there are a number of, already from this picture, you can see that there is some potential issue, right? And the fact that, for instance, you have words that may be toxic, maybe not, depending on the context, right? So the simplest example that I can give is the word frog, right? So it can relate to frog, the animal. It can relate to Pepe the Frog, which may be hateful. So like I said, it is designated as a symbol of hate, or not. Or it might actually be a toxic word, like a derogatory. So frog is a derogatory word for French people. So it might be used in that context, right? So if you should not take these values, these percentages as face values, right? So 0.4% of posts on 4chan contain the word frog, but doesn't necessarily mean that all these occurrences are toxic. They might be, they might be not, right? Okay, there are others that are not ambiguous, like the N word, for instance, is one of them. And so these are some of the things to keep in mind. And in fact, even if you use slightly more sophisticated tools to study toxicity, like the Google Perspective API, you should also be mindful that these have some limitations. Like, the Perspective API has been shown to be sort of vulnerable to sort of adversarial manipulation. So you might change the words a little bit, and that doesn't trigger toxicity. There's also some potential issues in biases of how that API was trained. So there are some concerns that it marks as more toxic words that are used in sort of more, for instance, African-American communities. So again, big issues. So I think we might have a question. I saw a hand up, and I also see a message on the chat. Are the words limited to English language? In this dictionary, yes. Perspective API has several languages. Some are in beta, some are actually production, but this dictionary is English only. All right, so and so these are sort of examples of how you can visualize some of the of these metrics that you run. So when we run the Perspective API, for instance, we essentially obtain a distribution of scores, right? So these are two examples of the Perspective scores. So several examples of Perspective scores. I mentioned there are several labels. The most used ones are toxicity and severe toxicity. So severe toxicity is a bit less vulnerable to maybe use of words that may be sort of borderline cuss words. Again, this might be depending on context, right? So there are some contexts where using a curse word automatically make a post toxic, and some where may be tolerated, right? So the severe toxicity is more like gives less weight to curse words, so it takes that into context, into account. Then there are other labels like whether a post is inflammatory, so might sort of push users to engage negatively in the conversation, has profanity, insults, is obscene, and so on. So these plots are called CDFs, cumulative distribution function, and is a quick way to visualize the distribution of toxicity. And so you can take a point on the plot. So for instance here, and you can see, so this gives you the fraction. I don't know if you can see what I'm drawing. Let me see if I can. Yes, I think you can see. Okay, so here, how do you read this graph? So here it tells you that 40% of posts have, let's say, 0.1 or less score, severe toxicity score. So 0.5 is like the median. So you can say, the median toxicity is about 0.2. Okay, and then you can see, okay, or you can say things like 80% of posts have 0.6 severe toxicity score or less, right? So that tells you, that gives you a very quick way to visualize distributions and compare, right? So, I could, for instance, right now I'm comparing toxicity to severe toxicity, but I could compare severe toxicity of 4chan posts to Twitter posts or Reddit posts, and you can see, look, the distribution of 4chan posts are significantly more toxic than other platforms, for instance, right? So, all libraries that you use have sort of easy way that you might use have easy way to generate this kind of plots. You can do it in like a couple of lines of code, really. So this is, I think, hopefully a good example. But I think now it's a good time to start thinking about the kind of challenges that you have to face when studying fringe communities, right? So I already mentioned some of them. So just as a recap, you have to understand that actions are not limited to the platform, right? So when you think of 4chan, you might think, okay, but this is a small community. Like, who cares if these people are highly toxic, are racist, or they support, Donald Trump racist policies, right? Well, I gave you some example at the beginning as to how even small communities like 4chan can get together, can coordinate, and mount attacks on other platforms. For instance, bullying people like Leslie Jones of Twitter, or creating a conspiracy theory that sort of get mainstream to the point that it influences people, how people vote, and maybe have an impact on elections, right? So it's important to understand that although a community like 4chan might be niche doesn't mean unimportant, okay? The other one is that these platforms are not your typical social networks. So you have these characteristics like anonymity or ephemerality that makes it different and makes it even maybe challenging to get data. Like the fact that all posts are deleted after a week, it means that you cannot just build some software that goes online and retrieves all posts. You have to do it real time. So we have a crawler that looks at all posts, and the moment they get archived, it gets retrieved. So this is challenging, right? Because you all know, like, servers get offline, air conditioning fails in the building, and your server is disconnected until someone goes and turns it back on. Hard drives fail. So you actually need to build an infrastructure that is resilient to all of this if you don't want to have huge gaps in your data, right? As an example. Or anonymity also means that you cannot do any sort of user level analysis. So that's important. The other challenge is knowing what they're talking about is not easy. There is really sort of a lingo that is not easy to interpret. So that means that you have to sort of go dive deep in these communities and understand the memes, understand so the terminology. And that's actually pretty disturbing as well, because then these things start to sort of sometimes trickle into your life. And all of a sudden, your friends say, okay, why you keep saying this word that I don't understand? And say, yeah, I've been just working on 4chan for too long. It's also risky because you might get attacked and doxxed. So we have been targeted by the 4chan community several times. They find out that we do research on them, and they dox us, so they put our information online, like our addresses, how to, where is our office, and especially in the US, university campuses are designed to be open. So anyone can walk into a classroom, anyone can walk into a building essentially, and come into your office. It's scary. I've also personally been concerned trolled. Someone sent an email to my head of department, but maybe I'll tell this off the record. I see some questions maybe. Right. Right. I'll read some of the questions. Right. What kind of challenges did you overcome? I know there's something. Is the data limited to words, or does contain the context, a sentence, for instance, within which they're used? Right. So the data is, for instance, in the setting here, is organized in posts, and we have the context of which thread they're in, and we usually run things on the whole post. We have also done the whole thread, but it doesn't really work that well. So like things like the toxicity evaluation from perspective API comes from the whole posts, which is usually short on 4chan. The data collected require human verification. So we have done some sort of sanity check to like see, in some cases, we use perspective API a lot, although it has a number of limitations that I mentioned. In some cases, it doesn't work that well. So that was trained, I think, on Reddit data and Wikipedia data that was manually annotated. In some context, it doesn't work really well. So what we usually do, we take a sample of data and we look at the toxicity scores that we get from perspective and check whether or not those make sense. So we do random samples, or we look at the highest of the toxicity scores and see if they make sense and things like that. So usually we do some kind of sampling to verify. So what kind of challenges did you overcome with the use of PII in the study? Yeah, so you can't use PII. So you can't look at personally identifiable information. So overall, I mean, this probably will require masterclass in its own with respect to sort of ethics and security standards. But I can tell you one thing, for instance, we never do user level analysis, even on platforms that are not anonymous. So we don't look at usernames, for instance, and we don't extract sort of single post level information that might contain PII. So even if a post doesn't have a username, might still have PII on that. So we only, long story short, we only look at sort of aggregate level analysis. And yes, we do have to go through ethics to do these kind of things. To answer the other question, so safety and security issues for researchers taken abroad. So we don't have any particular requirement on this specifically, but we have learned maybe the hard way to have some protocols in place. So to the point that now, when I submit proposals about this line of work, I obviously have to talk about ethics, but I also talk about safety of researchers. We have actually done a study specifically on safety of researchers. We have an upcoming CSCW paper that talks about this. We have done interviews with people. But anyway, we have a protocol in place now, yes. So when I submit proposals, I actually attach my protocol to it. And that requires, there is a number of things that I've learned. I've got training from people that work on like crime science and terrorism. So there are things like periodic disconnecting, making sure that the students have a real choice to choose a different project, even if they have invested some time on it. So you have to have a plan B for these kind of things. You always work in pairs at least. we don't go and interview users, but for those who do, there needs to be certain protocols with respect to user interviews, and there is a number of other things I'll be happy to share later on. So on 4chan, regarding anonymity, on 4chan, there is an IP-based recognition of your country, and there is a flag attached based on your country. Obviously, it's the best guess. IP geolocation is not perfect, and also can be fooled using, I don't know, Tor or VPNs. But you can also choose some what's called troll flags. So instead of displaying your country from your IP, you can choose things like the Kekistani flag. So. Okay. Right. So hopefully I answered the question. So then the other thing that I wanted to talk about with respect to 4chan is sort of a case study as to the fact that you should not look at platforms only in isolation. And is also something that is a case study of what sometimes exploratory research yields. Okay, so when we were looking at this data, we found out that the number one URL, sorry, the number one top one domain that was shared was archive.is. And so essentially it's like snapshots of posts from or websites from other platforms. And the second one was youtube.com. So there was a lot of YouTube, especially during a certain time, there was a lot of YouTube links. This might not be surprising because YouTube is, I think, generates the top traffic on the internet. I'm not sure, but it's definitely a big player. But we also saw in the data that along with links to YouTube, there were essentially prompts for users to engage with that video on YouTube, right? So, and this essentially led us to discover and understand and start working on a phenomenon that we call RAID, which is essentially a coordinated hate campaign, a coordinated abuse campaign that is sort of coordinated on one platform like 4chan and happens on another platforms like YouTube via the comments. Okay, so what happens? You see that someone posts a YouTube link on 4chan with a prompt like what to do, and the YouTube video starts getting hateful comments. Okay, so we started looking at this and we defined the concept of RAID, this happening, and we try to formalize it and studying using essentially signal processing techniques. So one hypothesis is that if a RAID is taking place, then you will see a peak in YouTube comments while the thread is alive. And the thread on 4chan and the YouTube comments may be synchronized. Okay, so this is an example actually of something that happened to me. So I gave a talk about one of our first study on 4chan, and someone I recorded it, and then at some point there was some press coverage of our work, and they linked to this video. Okay, and someone found it on 4chan, posted it on 4chan, and within minutes I had 10,000 views and a long series of hateful comments. Okay, I mean, trust me, no one has ever watched, no other video of mine has ever gotten even remotely close to 1,000 views. So imagine now 10,000 views. This doesn't happen organically, right? So it's definitely, and in fact, we did find the link. Someone posted on 4chan. So you can see this happening and can be very stressful for the victim. I can tell you it was for me. So when we look at these sort of peaks in activity, we can find some synchronization, right? So first of all, if we think of this activity as a time series, like time 0 is the time where the link was posted on 4chan, you see that a lot of the videos see peak commenting activity while the thread is alive. Remember, at some point it gets archived and that gets deleted, right? And we can actually measure the synchronization on this thing. So imagine you have two time series, and one is randomly shifted from the first by, let's say, 0.2 seconds on average. You can actually visualize and measure the synchronization, like, with the blue lines here, measure the per sample lag, and the red area is the density of the lag. So we can see, obviously the density of the curve peaked at 0.2 seconds because that's the average lag. So we can actually do this on the YouTube comments with respect to the thread on 4chan, but also differentiate between comments that have hate, have hateful words, and comments that do not have hate, right? So as you can see, this cluster of comments that have hate around the time where the YouTube link is posted on 4chan. Okay, and I have a question. Okay, do you find a difference in volume severity of hate depending on gender of the target? We did not look at this, but there is other work that, yes, has found significant differences in targets. So yes, both in gender and sort of race, whatever that means. And also sort of activism. So there are certain topics that attract essentially more hate, like feminism is one of them, for instance. Right. And so, what can we do about this, right? So most of the approaches that we have are pretty much reactive, right? So, there is some toxicity going on or some bullying. There is a hateful post and someone reports it. And, there is usually a mix of automated decision and moderated, so human moderators looking at reports and deciding what to do. But overall, mostly rely on feedbacks from the victims. So there are like very simple things. So there's in certain platforms, there are some words that automatically trigger a check or a ban or a post removal. But in other cases, there is people reporting like tweets, reporting Reddit posts and so on. And so overall, you have this scalability problem where you have, you need to get more and more moderators to go through flagged content. This might not necessarily be a social network priority. Moderators cost money. They introduce variability, false positives. It's actually a very sort of dangerous, very negative job to give to people. So it's very straining on mental health. And, there is essentially a lot of issues with these sort of reactive activities. And they're also slow, right? So we thought, can we actually use machine learning to try and predict raids, right? So essentially, you can see this as a warning system where we learn to recognize what videos might attract raids from 4chan, and so you can warn YouTube, you can warn the author of the video that they may be at risk of getting a raid. So we use machine learning, extracting features from videos, and from like a number of different angles, from the video itself, like so the content. So we use the transcript, the metadata of the video, like the title, the images, the thumbnail, and so on and so forth. And we put everything together into an ensemble classifier, and we see that we have a sort of a ground truth data set of videos that got rated, and we can predict that those videos are going to get rated with up to 94% accuracy, essentially, which is pretty high if you think about it. So one of the things that I mentioned before is this sort of interplay between communities, right? And I've really showed you an example of how this can happen, like these coordinated hate campaigns or raids where something starts on 4chan and targets another platforms like YouTube. And so now I'm going to give you another example with respect to misinformation, disinformation. And I'm going to use as an example, again, this Pizzagate conspiracy theory. So this was a conspiracy theory that started in 2016, where essentially it was alleged that the Democrats and Hillary Clinton were running a pedophile ring from the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. And this sort of started from WikiLeaks. You know, there was the emails from the DNC that were leaked and published on WikiLeaks. And someone went through the email and posted on 4chan sort of a theory. So they read something about a pizzeria and they started this theory that this was happening. And this was picked up by a number of other communities like Reddit, or also this InfoWars, Alex Jones website, which is a sort of famous disinformation actor and conspiracy theory actor. He's also known for saying that certain shootings, mass shootings at schools in the United States didn't happen. And then so this, you can think of these platforms as steering incubators and gateways to the mainstream world, and then they really went to the mainstream. So on maybe more mainstream platforms like Twitter or radio shows on TV, and it actually did go mainstream, and now it's evolved into the QAnon conspiracy theory. So how can we try to measure, to understand this kind of behavior, this kind of things unfolding on platforms, right? So one simple thing that you can do is to look at URLs, so sharing of news, and broadly categorize them as mainstream or alternative. So mainstream news, you can think of like, you know, the BBC or the Guardian. Alternative news, you can think of, you know, the InfoWars or the Daily Mail. And we try to build a model that captures the sequence of appearances for each URLs on multiple platforms. So for instance, like we have a URL, a link to a Breitbart News, which is one of these alternative news providers, so associated with a low degree of trustworthiness and a high degree of sort of disinformation. We see it appearing first on Reddit, and then on 4chan, and then on Twitter, right? So we can build this this model of sequences, right? And we do that through a graph. And we quantify the influence through a statistical tool called Hawk's processes, which allows us to keep into account a background rate. And so like what you expect normally to be a rate of sharing of a URL on a platform, but then take into account what we call impulse response. So something that may be happening because that URL was shared on another platform first. So that gives us confidence about the number of events, in this case, sharing of news URLs, they may be caused by another event on another platform, okay? And this allows us to start reasoning about causality, okay? So long story short, we build a model with 8 processes, which correspond to the platforms, the communities in our data sets. So we have Reddit, 4chan, Twitter, and like specific communities within Reddit. We fit each model with something called gauge sampling, and we calculate the percentage of events that are created because of events happen in each of the other processes. So if we can actually plot these percentages, and I mean, I'm going to skip the details here, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how to use these things. So to understand that, for instance, for alternative news, Twitter is very important. For mainstream, when it comes to Twitter, for alternative news, you have communities like the Donald, which is a subreddit that is now banned, that is associated to like supporting Donald Trump, but also spreading a number of conspiracy theories and misinformation. Paul, very much so. and then less so maybe other communities are politics. And this is it's a quite different picture when it comes to mainstream URLs. So the top influencer, for instance, are politics. Okay, so overall, these are, sorry, the slide I was mentioning about sort of the sequence, with respect to the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, and so you see a Breitbart link appearing on Reddit, then 4chan, then Twitter, and we use Hawk's processes. Okay, so here's what I wanted to show: these percentages that allow us to understand the influence that a community can have on the other. So you look at this matrix, and you can see, for instance, what is the influence that the Donald subreddit has on Twitter, and you can measure it both for alternative news URLs and mainstream news URLs. Okay, so I apologize again for talking without slides, but overall, these are examples of you can use tools from statistics like Hawk's processes or other tools to start reasoning about multi-platform, so the interplay between multiple platforms. And in this case, what we define as influence. So what are the events that are occurring because of events happening on another platform? So a news URL being shared on 4chan and discussed on 4chan causes it to then appear and being discussed on Twitter, for instance. Okay, so next case study is moving away from text and maybe URLs to images, and in particular memes. Okay, so there's a saying like so an image is worth 1,000 words, and this is this is true very much also for some of the socio-technical problems that we have been mentioning, with respect to online harms, right? So memes can be fun, but not always. They can be pretty toxic, and in fact, I already mentioned, Pepe the Frog is really used very much so from communities like 4chan, and not necessarily just showing the frog, but the fact that this frog is morphed evolves. So that's why like a meme, which is sort of the digital equivalent of genes, according to Richard Dawkins, and sort of evolves and has a sort of a life on its own. And so you can see some examples of how this Pepe the Frog gets morphed into different kind of messages, different forms to spread different kind of messages, like Hitler or even like Donald Trump, right? I don't know why this is not working. Okay, so it can be used in a very, very disturbing ways. Okay, but it also can be used effectively to spread maybe specific political messages, right? And I think the 2016 Brexit referendum, we know that there were certain pictures used by the Leave campaign and by Nigel Farage that were very powerful. And then, the Trump campaign also used a lot of these images to convey certain political messages. And so here is really important to understand there was a very big role played by these sort of seemingly tiny communities like 4chan in generating some images that really went viral besides 4chan. Right? So these are examples of pictures or memes that came from 4chan, and except the CNN one came from Reddit, that were actually posted or reposted by Trump or Trump's sons or other members of the Trump campaign, right? And they're very powerful messages, right? But overall, we see that some of these fringe communities are really into internet culture and really into memes. In fact, some of the shooters in some of the mass shooting events that happened in US and also in Canada and in New Zealand as well, were like, the investigators found a lot of memes in the material that they seized. Like this is like a Trump. You see a lot of the Trump memes in a van of a person that's that was involved in a mass shooting. So overall, memes have been weaponized like everything else, and so we started thinking of what tools we can use to understand how memes are weaponized, and what is the influence that different communities have when it comes to weaponized memes. So here we had a really ambitious project that allowed us to create a memes processing pipeline. So we were able to collect and study 160 million images that were collected from a number of platforms. So this obviously, how do you go about, we can't just open 160 million images and look at them, and how do you identify sort of different variants of a meme, right? Or even if you use image processing techniques to understand that this image has like connected to each other. So the way we do it is to first cluster all images that are visually similar, and the visual similarity is something that you can get from tools like perceptual hashing. And then we automatically annotate images using Know Your Meme, which is sort of the Wikipedia of memes, using a trick, essentially. What we do, we cluster images that are visually similar. Then we take one image that we believe is representative of the cluster, and that's the madoid of the cluster. It's the node in the cluster that has the smallest distance to all other nodes in that cluster. Okay, and then we search. Essentially, we use that image to retrieve an entry from the encyclopedia of memes, like Know Your Meme, that has labeling, right? It says, okay, this is a Pepe the Frog meme, this is a distracted boyfriend meme, or whatever. Right? Okay, so now we have essentially annotated our clusters. Each cluster is roughly corresponds to a meme with all these different variants. And then we can do all sort of analysis, including the influence estimation like we did before on news URLs. Now we can do it on memes. So, these are examples of clusters. So these are, this button meme and all other sort of kind of memes. And then you start looking at what are the top memes for social networks. For instance, on like things like on Twitter, you see very different kinds of memes. Then on 4chan, very toxic, very weaponized memes. This is Pepe the Frog, or the merchant meme was the second most common meme on 4chan. This is a highly anti-Semitic meme. We can visualize them. We have a number of tools that we used, something called GFI, very useful to visualize the clusters. We have a website. You can actually these are clickable, these clusters. You can hover on the cluster and see the madoid, or actually look at every single entry in that cluster. And you can start, doing all sort of exploratory work on this meme. I see a question. Yes, I'll be sharing this slide. Like I said, you can look at things evolution over time. For instance, like how are memes shared over time, and you see certain peaks, for instance, and you can try to understand what creates those peaks. So, for instance, on Twitter, there was like a big peak around the presidential debate. Then around the elections, there's a peak in meme sharing on poll, and a number of other things. So I see another question. Let's see. Are the number of clusters predetermined? It depends on what tools you use. No, we did not predetermine the number of clusters. We set a threshold on the distance. but depends on what clustering algorithm you use. Okay. Then we look at influence. So like we did before with the news URLs, sorry, we do the same with memes. And so, we also classify memes as racist or politically charged. And for instance, when it comes to racist memes, surprise, surprise, Paul, so the 4chan politically incorrect board is the most influential in terms of spreading racist memes on other platforms, including mainstream ones like Reddit and Twitter. Okay. All right. So, but I'm going to skip this because I'm sort of running out of time. I think I want to. Okay. Yes. Right. So the other. Right. Okay. Then I want to talk about now so far we've seen sort of community level studies. We get data from Reddit, Twitter, 4chan, Gab, Parler, whatever, and we have either exploratory kind of work or research questions. But what about state level adversaries, right? So there's been a lot of attention focused on activities coordinated by Russian actors, for instance, in some of the elections, and these are sort of informally known as trolls, like state-sponsored accounts that were operated to sow discord, to spread misinformation, and so on. So we actually have data that has been released by platforms like Twitter and Reddit about accounts that they themselves had identified as state-sponsored actors, led, coordinated. So we actually study. Now we can look at the data and study and understand, for instance, their behavior. Okay, so we've done a number of things on these trolls. One is to sort of just look at their behavior and see how they compare to random accounts, how influential they were, what kind of images, memes they use, whether or not this behavior can be predicted. So we have now some ongoing work that tries to learn to characterize the behavior of these trolls so that we can recognize them in advance. And we have some collaboration with Reddit on this. But overall, let me give you some example about this state level adversary. So you can see that they use a lot of images. This is some examples of memes that were identified by Reddit and Twitter as being posted, as actually generated, created by state level adversaries. You can see, I don't know, Hillary Clinton being chased by the FBI. And but you can also see that there are certain kinds of sort of behaviors that they exhibit. So they pose as sort of news outlets or Trump supporters and things like that. They pretend to be posting from like number of worldwide and sort of locations, including the United States, even though they are Russian operated. They use specific hashtags to try and get attention, or maybe even sort of hijack a conversation. So on Twitter you have these trending hashtags, and you can click on the hashtag and see the discussion. So what we observe, some of the trolls actually use that feature to appear in the stream of the trending hashtags. But there is a number of things that are particularly interesting. They try to hijack the Black Lives Matter conversation, and then use other sort of politically charged hashtag like MAGA or Islam kills and so on. We also see an interesting behavior where these accounts, they sort of morph, they change the screen names. So for instance, like an example, they create an account and they start to they start to post as, maybe like a local community organized account like Online Houston, and then they change their name to Houston Top News, and then now pose as a news outlet. But overall, like 10%, almost 10% of the Russian accounts changed their screen names. So this is, almost 4 times. This is orders of magnitude more than a regular account. Not many people change their name, and they do it multiple times, right? So this is clearly a characteristic that could be used by platforms to detect potentially, what these activities. And now the question becomes, do they have to do it or not? And in some cases, yes, because they gather followers by acting in a certain way. And also creating accounts is not cheap, right? So you have to pass verification like CAPTCHAs, you have to have a phone number, you have to build a network of followers, you have to make it appear as a known. It shouldn't be obvious that account is a troll. So what you do is you actually use the same account multiple times for multiple campaigns, right? So if you start detecting trolls by using a screen name change, it's actually it's maybe a sort of a effective way to make it more difficult for trolls to operate, because they will have to redo this, right? If you stop them. We see a lot of deletion. So when sort of they go through these metamorphoses, they also delete a lot of tweets, much more than sort of regular accounts. And they do it in particular when they sort of get repurposed. So we see that some of these Russian trolls, for instance, they were used first in the Brexit referendum, and then they gear up for like a Trump campaign. And then when the FBI investigation came back for Hillary Clinton, they got repurposed to focus on Hillary. So there is a number of things that we observe. Okay, let me skip this. So overall, we find differences, like really clear differences in the use of Twitter platform between Russian trolls and random users. There is this concept really of resetting their persona by changing names, deleting tweets, and they were very influential, both in terms of spreading propaganda and also spreading misinformation, and both in sort of purely textual form and in an imagery sort of meme form. Okay, and like I said, we're now learning how to predict, how to identify trolls as they operate, not after the fact, right? So what has happened, regularly is that Twitter periodically said, "Oh, we discovered there was a campaign, and here are the usernames of the accounts that we identified." The first time they did that was, because they were compelled to. There was the Mueller investigation, so they had to cooperate and provides information, but now they periodically do it. Every time they discover, allegedly, every time they discover a state level campaign, they take these accounts offline and then release some information about it, and which is usually available to the academic community. So I see a question. Yes, we're talking about trolls 2016 elections. Right. So one last case study that I wanted to cover is with respect to misogyny, online misogyny, and just to sort of move away from maybe more traditional social networks like Twitter, or the sort of more well-known fringe communities like 4chan. And so there's some work that we've been doing in the context of the manosphere, which is a conglomerate of communities that are sort of, they are there you can put them together because of their web-based presence and their activity in anti-feminism movement and their interests, the common interest. Sorry. Their common interests around so-called men's issues. Okay, so these communities have grown, I would say, almost exponentially over the past years, and they've actually become more and more of a problem, not only in the digital sphere but also in the real world. So, for instance, a community that has been a lot in the news in the UK has been the incels. They're part of the manosphere. There was a real world incident in Blackpool about a month ago. And this is only the last of the incidents of that occur in the real world, like with mass shootings in the US and in Canada, perpetrated by a member of the incel community. So what are the incel community? So incel stands for involuntary celibates. So it's a sort of a community of men that find it hard to date women, and they have this concept of the black pill, which is a revolution of the red pill concept from the Matrix, which is common in many platforms like 4chan, where essentially you wake up by eating the red pill, and now you see the world as it really is. So in the black pill, so essentially the theory is that genetically inferior men have no chance of getting laid, of dating women. This is actually a definition from an incel's Wikipedia page, so it's run by incel. Like I said, they've been in the news more and more because of things like the Isla Vista killings in Santa Barbara in 2014 and all the way to like a month ago. So the idea of our work is, again, to use data science tools to understand, to study the manosphere, and in particular, its evolution. Okay, so we got data from Reddit, some standalone forums. So we have millions of posts again, and we try to understand how the evolution of the popularity and the level of activity of the manosphere. And you can see like the percentage of posts on different communities. So there are different communities, like besides the incels I already mentioned, things like men's rights activists, pickup artists, which is a community that essentially trades tricks on how to pick up, to date women. And then this red pill community, the incels, and more like MGTOW is men going their own way. So it's essentially it's a community of people, of men who decide not to date women. So it's not involuntary like incels, and it's highly toxic community. So you can see this is an evolution. Some communities sort of have died down. Some communities like incel and MGTOW are on the rise over the years. And the activity also evolves in a different way. And overall, this sort of temporal analysis allows us to understand that the manosphere is very dynamic, and older communities are being overshadowed by newer ones that are actually more toxic. We also look at migration or intersection in users across communities. So we see, and here we don't do any particular we don't try to match users other than like having users that have the same username. And again, we only look at aggregates. So we essentially find users that were at some point were on both communities, and then they sort of stop being one community and they only are in another community, right? So that gives us an intuition of migration of users. And we can do it both relative to the source and relative to the destination. So we see a lot of migration at some point happening toward MGTOW, and again there is some overlap in the communities, definitely. So they migrate between communities. They may be active in multiple communities at the same time. And the last question in this line of work was also to understanding how the topics they discuss change over time, and in particular, whether or not the speech becomes more toxic or misogynistic. We use the API, the Perspective API, and we have a baseline of obviously of toxicity on for instance on Reddit, and then we can compare how these communities, whether or not they're more toxic or not. So you can see relatively steady toxicity in pickup artists and men rights activists, but a substantial increase overall in these newer communities where people are migrating to, like incels and MGTOW. So again, like I said, newer communities such as are increasingly more toxic. Okay. Okay. Let me start to wrap up, so we have some more time for questions. On the incels, we also have a study on deplatforming, which again it probably takes like a masterclass on its own, several hours, and understanding how when these communities get banned, let's say for instance on Reddit, some subreddit gets closed or quarantined, or some websites get completely deplatformed, like it has happened for instance with things like Gab or Parler, right? So what you see is that payment providers refuse to work with them, or even service providers like Cloudflare, Amazon, and so on refuse to host their website. So these communities are taken offline, but they obviously don't disappear, right? So this has happened, for instance, with incels on Reddit, they got banned, or the Donald I mentioned, the subreddit got banned, or so we're talking about community level deplatforming, not specific users, like when Donald Trump got banned from Twitter, YouTube, and so on, right? So we're talking about community levels, like closing a whole subreddit, or taking down a whole website like Gap, right? So we look at a community level deplatforming, and it is an interesting question to understand what happens to those communities. They don't disappear, right? Usually they migrate somewhere else, either on the dark web, or they create some new forums. And we did a particular case studies on incels. So they moved from Reddit to a standalone forum. And what you see essentially is that on the one hand, the community shrinks in size. So the audience of this community gets reduced, which you might argue is a positive effect. Maybe less people are exposed to misogynistic, toxic views. But on the other hand, they get even more radicalized. So there's a number of reasons why this happens. There are, like, for instance, users that are sort of the early adopters or the founders of these new communities dominate the discussion, and they're very much usually on the radical toxic side of things. There is less interaction with other points of view. So overall, we can confidently say that users who do migrate to the other communities get even more radicalized, which is a negative effect, arguably, of the deplatforming. But again, this it should take probably 2 hours by itself. And I also want to stress that there are considerations here that go well beyond the technical aspects of computer science. And in fact, I always say, like, computer scientists should not be allowed to make determinations on the good or the evilness of technology, because we've made way too many mistakes in the past. All right, so moving forward, I think there are still a lot of problems remaining, obviously, in the online harms space, and Rephrain hopefully will tackle many of them. I think overall, we made a lot of progress in gaining a quantitative understanding of the problems, There is the community has done, I think, a good job at also sharing expertise with respect to, for instance, data collection and the issues that come with it. Also making data available with these initiatives like, open data. There are platforms like Zenodo or conferences like SCWSM that encourage people to share data. There are a number of tools, for instance, from the natural language processing community. You think about Word2Vec or BERT, or deep learning, obviously, that allowed us to do really large-scale quantitative analysis of some of these socio-technical issues. So that's pretty good. But I think there is a couple of things where we're still lagging behind. One is sort of proactively sort of proactive countermeasures, and sort of real-time detection of all of these issues, an active fight against weaponized information. I think we're lagging behind a lot with respect to policy and accountability. I'm not a big fan of the online harms safety bill. I'm happy to talk about it offline. There are a number of I think significant issues there. And also I think we're lagging behind with respect to sort of a real qualitative understanding of the problem. So and in particular with respect to collaborations between computer scientists and social scientists. I think that sometimes we have sort of misaligned incentives in that respect. There's very few initiatives that truly support interdisciplinary work. And in a lot of cases, it's just sort of pretending. It's very hard to publish truly interdisciplinary work because, essentially, if you do work in the intersection of social science and computer science, most of the time you have to decide to submit to either a computer science or a social science, funding agency or journal or conference, and something that is in the middle sometimes is you are in a disadvantage because maybe it's not strong enough, from the computer science perspective. So the computer science reviewers sort of bash it, or vice versa, right? There aren't, maybe, like I said, really great ways to evaluate truly interdisciplinary work. So you have sometimes misaligned incentives, like I said. We also speak different languages, so to speak. So there are very few. I mean, we have excellent examples of great interdisciplinary collaborations, but I want to stress, as someone who's tried to do it for many years, there are sort of structural obstacles there. Like I said, I already mentioned some of the risks. We spend a lot of time measuring jerks on the web, and I mean, I have some slides here that you can see some of the poll threads about us, and even they made memes of us. So, for instance, my colleague Gianluca gave an interview to Nature, and it became like a meme. Got turned into an anti-Semitic meme, and even got attacked by Daily Stormer, which is a literal neo-Nazi community. And there is a number of memes. And again, I'll make the slides available so you can see some of the things that we went through.